The Perseverance platform rose from the Arctic Sea like a demon's skeleton, all sharp angles and steel bones wrapped in ice. I'd worked rigs before, Gulf of Mexico, North Sea, but nothing prepared me for this. The derrick disappeared into darkness 300 feet up, where the wind screamed through the crown block like a banshee. The massive drilling tower swayed slightly in the endless night, its movements barely visible against the star-strewn sky. The platform's floodlights cast long shadows that seemed to dance and twist with unnatural purpose, as if they were trying to break free from their sources. The decision to take this job wasn't made lightly. I'd spent weeks agonizing over it, watching our savings dwindle as Sarah's condition worsened. $1,200 per day. Night shift roughneck needed immediately. The ad had caught my eye while I was scrolling through job listings, trying to figure out how to make this month's mortgage payment. Sarah's medical bills weren't going to pay themselves, and with little Emily's college fund already drained, I was running out of options. The treatments were experimental, not covered by insurance, but they were her last hope. When you're watching your wife fade away while your daughter asks questions you can't answer, pride takes a back seat to necessity. The recruiter had been vague about the details, his voice oddly hesitant during our video call. Arctic experience preferred but not required. Must be willing to follow strict protocols. Housing provided. What they didn't mention was the darkness, the kind that swallows you whole and never really leaves, not during this time of year. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes you question whether the sun ever existed at all. They also didn't mention the rules, or why they existed, or what happened to those who broke them. I remember my last conversation with Sarah before boarding the helicopter. "Just 6 months," I'd promised, kissing her pale forehead. "That's all we need to get ahead." Emily had clung to my leg, her small face buried in my jeans. "Bring me back a polar bear, Daddy," she'd said, and I'd forced a laugh, pretending I didn't see the worry in Sarah's eyes. Now, standing on the helipad as the chopper disappeared into the darkness, those memories felt like they belonged to another life entirely. First time on Arctic waters? A deep voice cut through my thoughts. I turned to find a hulking man studying me, his face partially obscured by a thermal mask. The name patch on his heavy winter jacket read Mendez. Ice had formed in his beard where it poked out from beneath the mask, and his eyes held the weight of someone who'd seen things that defied explanation. He didn't wait for my answer, just thrust a yellowed paper into my gloved hands. "Rules. Memorize them. Out here they're more important than your survival gear." I almost laughed. Almost. But something in his eyes stopped me. That 1,000-yard stare you see in combat veterans. Whatever he'd seen up here had left its mark, carved deep into his psyche like the ice that coated every surface of the rig. "I've worked rigs before," I said, trying to sound confident. "Down in Texas." "This isn't Texas." Mendez cut me off sharply, his breath forming frozen clouds that seemed to linger too long in the air. "The Arctic doesn't care about your experience. Out here, the cold is just the beginning of what can kill you. The darkness, it changes things. Changes people. The rules are all we have." The paper crinkled in my hands as I unfolded it, the sound unnaturally loud in the muffled Arctic air. The rules were typed out in faded ink, the paper stiff and weathered like it had been printed decades ago, the corners worn smooth by countless hands. 1. Always count the crew before starting your shift. If there's one extra, leave the platform immediately. Do not attempt to identify the extra person. 2. The radio system operates on channel 7 only. If you hear communications on any other channel, do not respond. If someone claiming to be supervision tries to contact you between 200 and 300, ignore it regardless of channel. 3. The derrick camera feeds must be monitored at all times. If you see movement above the monkey board, 150 feet, switch off that particular camera immediately and log it. Do not attempt to restore the feed until after sunrise. 4. During your shift, you may hear the sound of pipe connections being made when no drilling is in progress. This is normal. If you hear the sound of children laughing, initiate emergency shutdown procedures immediately. 5. If you see crew members near the waterline at night, do not approach them. Report their position to supervision and avoid that area for the remainder of your shift. Do not attempt to communicate with them, regardless of who they appear to be. 6. The flickering of lights is common due to generator load changes. If lights flicker, count to 30. If they don't stabilize, switch to emergency power immediately and remain in darkness until 0400. Do not, under any circumstances, use alternative light sources during this period. 7. In case of total power failure, do not use personal light sources, flashlights, phone lights, etc. The emergency lights will activate automatically after 90 seconds. If they don't, remain where you are until they do, regardless of what you hear or feel. 8. If you notice your reflection in any surface doesn't match your movements exactly, avoid looking at it and report to the infirmary immediately. Do not attempt to touch or interact with the reflection. 9. The crew mess hall closes at 2100 hours. If you see lights on or smell food cooking after this time, do not investigate. If you hear voices coming from the mess hall after hours, do not respond, regardless of who is calling your name. 10. Keep track of time with your own watch. Do not rely on the rig's clocks. If they show different times, report to supervision and remain in the control room until relieved. Do not attempt to synchronize or adjust the rig's timepieces. I folded the paper and looked up at Mendez, who was watching me intently. This some kind of joke? Hazing the new guy? He didn't smile. The wind howled around us, carrying what sounded like whispers just below the threshold of understanding. You've got 12 hours to decide if you believe it or not. After that, he shrugged, the movement made awkward by his heavy winter gear. Well, let's just say belief isn't required for the rules to apply. They've been here longer than any of us, and they'll be here long after we're gone. The first few hours of my shift passed without incident, though every shadow seemed to hold something just out of sight. I familiarized myself with the control room, checked pressure gauges, and monitored the drilling operations with methodical precision. The night crew was small, 12 people total, including me. Most kept to themselves, focused on their tasks with an intensity that seemed excessive, even for the dangerous work we were doing. Their eyes held the same haunted look I'd seen in Mendez's, and they moved with the careful deliberation of people who knew they were being watched. The control room itself was a maze of monitors and gauges, each one displaying critical information about the rig's operations. But it was the security camera feeds that drew my attention most often. They showed every corner of the platform in grainy black and white, the images occasionally distorted by static or interference. I found myself counting the crew members on screen compulsively, relief washing over me each time I reached 12. Around midnight, I made my first rounds of the external walkways. The temperature had dropped to negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind cut through my thermal gear like razor wire. The steel beneath my boots groaned and shifted with each step, ice crackling under my weight. Above me, the derrick vanished into the darkness, its warning lights pulsing steadily against the starless sky. The Arctic Ocean stretched out endlessly in all directions, a black void that seemed to be watching, waiting. That's when I heard it. The distinct sound of pipe connections being made, the heavy clang of metal on metal. I looked up at the derrick, expecting to see the drill string in motion, but everything was still. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by what sounded like voices carrying on the wind. They spoke in whispers, their words just barely out of reach, but something about them made my skin crawl. Rule 4 flashed through my mind. Not children laughing, I told myself. Just the wind playing tricks. But in the back of my mind, I could hear Emily's voice calling out across the frozen wasteland. "Bring me back a polar bear, Daddy." The words seemed to echo off the steel structure, distorting until they were barely recognizable as human speech. I quickened my pace, completing my inspection as fast as safely possible. The walkways seemed longer somehow, stretching out before me like they were trying to keep me from reaching my destination. Shadows moved in my peripheral vision, always just out of sight when I turned to look. The cold bit deeper, seeming to reach past my skin and into my soul. Back in the control room, I found Martinez, the senior operator, staring intently at the camera feeds. His face was illuminated by the blue glow of the monitors, making him look almost corpse-like in the artificial light. "Everything okay?" I asked, stamping the snow from my boots. He didn't look away from the screens. Camera 3 picked up movement at the monkey board level, had to switch it off. His voice was tight, controlled, but I could hear the underlying tension. "You'll see things up there sometimes. Things that shouldn't be possible at that height. Things that don't show up in the maintenance logs." I felt my stomach tighten. Rule 3. What kind of movement? Martinez shook his head, finally turning to look at me. His eyes were bloodshot, like he hadn't blinked in hours. "We don't ask those questions out here, amigo. You'll learn. The answers, they don't help. They just make it harder to come back for your next shift." The night wore on. I tried to focus on the routine tasks, checking gauges, monitoring pressures, logging data. But every shadow seemed to move when viewed directly, and the constant groaning of the rig's structure kept me on edge. The darkness outside the windows felt alive somehow, pressing against the glass like it was trying to find a way in. At 01:55, the radio crackled to life. "Control room. This is Thompson." The voice was crystal clear, which was unusual given the weather conditions. "I need someone to check the mud tanks. Pressure's reading wrong up here." There was something off about the voice, a subtle wrongness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I reached for the radio, but Martinez's hand shot out, gripping my wrist with surprising strength. His fingers were ice cold even through my thermal gear. "Check your watch," he said quietly, his eyes never leaving the radio. "Always check your watch." Rule 2. No radio contact between 0200 and 0300, regardless of who calls. "But that's Thompson," I protested. "I just saw him an hour ago." "Did you?" Martinez's eyes were hard, reflecting the glow of the monitors like mirrors. "Count the crew, right now." I pulled up the security feeds, counting quickly. 12 people, all accounted for, including Thompson, who was clearly visible in the mudroom, nowhere near the position he'd claimed to be calling from. As I watched, he turned toward the camera and gave a small wave, his movements perfectly normal, perfectly human. The radio crackled again. "Control room, respond." The voice was different now, distorted, like multiple people speaking in unison. "I can see you in there. Why won't you answer?" The words were followed by a sound that might have been laughter, might have been screaming. We sat in silence, watching the cameras as the minute hand crept past 200. The radio went silent, but the lights began to flicker, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. 1, 2, 3. I counted under my breath, my heart pounding harder with each number. Martinez joined me, our voices barely audible over the howling wind outside. The darkness between the flickers seemed to grow longer, deeper, more absolute. 28, 29, 30. The lights stabilized, but the relief was short-lived. On camera 6, a figure stood at the waterline, barely visible in the rig's exterior lighting. It wore the same heavy winter gear as the crew, but something about its movements seemed wrong, too fluid for the bulky clothing. It moved like something wearing a human suit, learning how to use it. "Don't," Martinez warned as I stood up. "Rule 5. We log it and wait." His voice cracked slightly. "No matter what we see, no matter who we think it is." I watched the figure on the screen. It turned slowly, facing the camera, and raised a hand in greeting. The image quality was poor, but I could have sworn it was wearing my face. Not a copy, not a twin, but my face, exactly as I'd seen it in the mirror that morning. It smiled, and the expression was wrong, like it had learned about smiling from a book, but had never quite understood the concept. The next few hours passed in tense silence. The figure by the waterline eventually disappeared, though sometimes I thought I could see it in other cameras, always at the edge of the frame, always wearing my face. The radio remained quiet, but occasionally we'd hear sounds from elsewhere in the rig, footsteps in empty corridors, voices having conversations that didn't quite make sense, the continuing clang of pipe connections where no work was being done. At 0530 my relief arrived. Thompson himself, looking exhausted but very much alive. His movements were normal, human, nothing like the fluid grace of the figure by the waterline. "How was your first night?" he asked, settling into the control room chair. His eyes held the same haunted look I'd seen in everyone else's, the look I suspected I'd soon be wearing myself. I hesitated, looking at Martinez, who was gathering his things without making eye contact. "Interesting," I said finally. "The rules take some getting used to." The paper crinkled in my pocket, the rules now burned into my memory like scars. Thompson nodded. "Yeah, they do. But hey, at least you made it. Last guy didn't even finish his first shift." "What happened to him?" "Broke Rule 1. Thompson's voice was flat. "Counted 13 crew members instead of 12. Tried to figure out who the extra person was. And he found out." Thompson turned to the monitors, effectively ending the conversation. But as he moved, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in one of the darkened screens. It didn't turn with him. I changed out of my work gear in the locker room, my hands shaking slightly as I packed my bag. The yellowed rule sheet crinkled in my pocket as I moved. Part of me wanted to walk straight to the helipad and never look back, but the thought of Sarah's medical bills, of little Emily's future, kept me rooted in place. Sometimes the things that haunt us aren't supernatural at all. As I walked to the crew quarters, I passed a group of workers heading out for the day shift. I counted them automatically, a habit I'd apparently already developed. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. The last person in line turned and smiled at me with my own face. Not a mirror image, not a copy, but my face, worn like a mask that didn't quite fit. Its eyes were wrong, too deep, too dark, like looking into the Arctic Ocean at midnight. I ran. The helipad was empty when I reached it, the morning helicopter not due for another hour. The wind howled around me, carrying what sounded like laughter, children's laughter, from somewhere up in the derrick. My watch read 0631, but the rig's clock showed 0300, its hands moving backward with deliberate purpose. The radio in my pocket crackled. "Going somewhere?" My voice asked through the static. "But you've only just arrived. Don't you want to meet yourself properly?" I looked back at the rig, its massive frame silhouetted against the endless Arctic night. Somewhere up there, a pipe connection clanged, the sound echoing across the frozen sea. In the darkness between the warning lights, Something moved with that same wrong fluidity I'd seen before. I took out my phone and dialed Sarah's number. The connection was surprisingly clear, as if the endless miles of Arctic Ocean between us had momentarily ceased to exist. "Hey," I said when she answered, trying to keep my voice steady. "I made it through my first shift. The pay's good and I think I'll stay. Just wanted you to know I'm safe." The last word felt like ash in my mouth. The lie felt bitter, but what choice did I have? The darkness stretched out around me, broken only by the rig's lights and the distant flicker of the aurora borealis, which seemed to form patterns that almost made sense, almost spelled out words I didn't want to read. Behind me, I heard footsteps on the helipad. My footsteps. But I hadn't moved. I didn't turn around. Rule 1 was very clear about not trying to identify the extra crew member. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, some questions better left unasked. But I could feel its presence behind me, radiating a cold that went beyond the Arctic chill. "Sarah needs you," the thing wearing my voice said from behind me. "Emily misses her daddy. Don't you want to go home to them?" The words struck like physical blows. The thing knew about my family, knew their names. My hands clenched into fists inside my gloves, every instinct screaming to turn and face whatever stood behind me. But Mendez's words echoed in my mind. "Out here, the cold is just the beginning of what can kill you." "The helicopter will be here soon," I said to the wind, to myself, to whatever listened in the darkness. "I just need to make it until then." A laugh. My laugh, but wrong, like a recording played backward and then forward again, came from behind me. "Time works differently here. Haven't you noticed? Check your watch again." I didn't want to, but my eyes dropped to my wrist automatically. The digital display read 0631, just as it had before. But as I watched, the numbers began to shift. 300, 200, 100. Time spiraling backward like water down a drain. The radio crackled again. "Control room to new guy," Martinez's voice called out. But Martinez had gone off shift, was supposed to be in his bunk by now. "We need you back inside. Something's wrong with camera 3. Shows 13 people in the drill floor. But that can't be right, can it?" I kept my eyes fixed on the horizon, where the first hint of dawn should have been appearing. But there was only darkness, deeper and more absolute than before. The auroras above had taken on a sickly green tinge, their patterns forming and reforming into shapes that looked disturbingly like faces. Familiar faces. Sarah. Emily. My own. The thing behind me moved closer. I could feel its breath on my neck, warm where everything else was cold. "They say the Arctic darkness drives men mad," it said in my voice. "But that's not quite right. It doesn't drive us mad. It shows us what's really there, what's always been there, hidden behind the light." A new sound rose above the wind, children laughing. Not just any children. Emily's laugh, multiplied and distorted, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Rule 4 demanded emergency shutdown procedures, but I couldn't remember if that applied on the helipad. The rules suddenly seemed insufficient, like trying to fight a forest fire with a garden hose. "I have to go back inside," I said, still not turning. "My shift starts again in 12 hours. "Does it?" The thing's voice had changed, becoming less like mine, more like something that had never been human at all. Time is funny out here. 12 hours might be 12 minutes, or 12 years. Sarah's already forgotten your face. Emily calls another man Daddy now. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from Sarah, but when I pulled it out, the screen showed that impossible time, 0300. The message read, Come home. We miss you. All three of us. 3. We were a family of 3, me, Sarah, and Emily. Unless, another buzz. A picture this time. Sarah and Emily smiling at the camera. And behind them, barely visible in the background, a figure in Arctic weather gear. Its face, my face, twisted into that wrong smile. The radio erupted in static, then multiple voices speaking at once. Control room, we have 13. Movement above the monkey board. Lights in the mess hall. Reflections aren't matching. Children laughing in the... All the rules being broken at once. The rig's warning lights began to flicker and I found myself counting automatically. 1, 2, 3. But I knew they wouldn't stabilize at 30. Not this time. Welcome to perseverance, the thing behind me said, its voice now a chorus of all the voices I'd ever had, from childhood to present. Time to meet yourself. I ran. The helipad disappeared behind me as I sprinted back toward the rig. Better to face whatever waited inside than what stood behind me wearing my face. The wind carried Emily's laughter, Sarah's voice, my own distorted words, weaving them together into a symphony of wrongness. I reached the main deck and yanked open the heavy door, throwing myself inside. The corridor stretched before me, longer than it should have been, the lights flickering in a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. On every reflective surface, windows, gauge faces, steel walls, my reflection watched me with eyes that weren't mine. The rules. I had to remember the rules. They were all that stood between me and whatever waited in the Arctic darkness. I pulled out the yellowed paper, but the words had changed, rearranging themselves as I watched. Rule 1, count yourself. Rule 2, answer when you call. Rule 3, watch yourself watching. Rule 4, listen to your children. Rule 5, follow yourself down. Rule 6, stay in the dark where you belong. Rule 7, the lights lie. Rule 8, your reflection is the true you. Rule 9, hunger never ends. Rule 10, time is a circle. You've always been here. The paper crumbled to dust in my hands, leaving me alone in the flickering corridor. Somewhere above, pipe connections clanged in the derrick. Somewhere below, something that wore my face walked the waterline. And somewhere, everywhere, the Arctic darkness waited, patient, as only ancient things can be. I checked my watch one last time. 0300. Always 0300. The lights went out, and in the darkness I finally understood why Rule 1 existed. It wasn't to protect us from counting 13 crew members. It was to protect us from realizing we'd always been the 13th. I heard footsteps approaching, my footsteps, and this time I turned around. After all, some rules are made to be broken, even if we break ourselves in the process.